Shortly after 6 o'clock that morning, the telephone from Sagan had called Oberregierungsrat Max Wieland out of his bed in Breslau. He was area chief of the Kriminalpolizei, and as soon as he realized the extent of the break, he ordered a Grossfahndung. That was the nationwide hue and cry, the highest search order in Germany. The German radio broadcasted the news, and thousands of troops and auxiliaries turned out to search. Gestapo and Sicherheitspolizei worked through all trains checking papers, searched vehicles on the roads, patrolled the roads, checked hotels and houses and farms. The warnings went out to all the SS Army and Luftwaffe troops in the neighborhood, and out from their homes for miles around came the old men and boys of the Landwehr and Landwacht, a sort of home guard to watch over the fields and lanes. Far away in ports like Stettin and Danzig, the Kriegsmarine cooperated with the Gestapo and Polizei to prevent any escapees slipping across to Sweden as stowaways. Around the Czech, Swiss, Danish and French borders, the Grenzpolizei were alerted. For 100 miles around Sagan itself, the country was thick with searching Germans. It developed into the greatest search in Germany during the war up to that time. Wieland that morning appointed Criminal Commissar Dr. Absalon to inquire fully into the circumstances of the break and furnish a report. After getting out of the tunnel, Marshall and Valenta had walked cautiously through the woods for 10 minutes until they emerged from the trees. Their direction had been good. In front of them was a narrow road, and directly opposite, beyond criss-crossing railway lines shining dimly in the dark, they saw Sagan Station. They walked up and down looking for the entrance to the subway which, they had been told, led under the tracks to the booking office and platforms. Unfortunately, a shed had been built over the subway entrance as a shelter from the weather, and it was unrecognizable in the dark from the description they had. For some time they searched for the subway, which was right under their noses. A couple more dark shapes emerged from the woods, and then 2 more. They couldn't find the subway either, and before long there were a dozen or so tramping up and down looking for it. A couple of times Marshall heard muffled curses, and once, distinctly, an angry English voice asking where the hell the bloody subway was. By the grace of God, no Germans heard. In desperation, Marshall and Valenta pushed open the door of the shed to see what was there. A couple of trains had come and gone already, and then they heard the air raid sirens. They couldn't see anything in the darkness of the shed, and while they were wondering what to do, a German poked his head around the door and flashed a torch on them. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Don't you know the siren has gone and you must go to the shelter?" Valenta mumbled something at him in German, and they brushed past out into the road again. There was only one train left that they could catch. It meant a dubious change of trains later on, and in any case the train might be held up by the air raid. If the escape were discovered early, the train was bound to be searched. "It's not worth the risk," Valenta said. "Let's strike down on foot for Czechoslovakia. I know the way, and I can get help there fairly easily." They turned back into the woods, heading for the road that skipped the western boundary of the camp, found the road, and followed it till they were out of the camp area. They tried then to walk parallel to it across the fields, but it was too slushy, and they had to go back to the road and take the risk of running into Germans. Well before dawn they came to the Breslau Autobahn, running about 12 miles south of the camp, crossed over it, and as dawn broke sheltered deep in some woods. They stayed there shivering with cold all day, and too keyed up to sleep. At dusk they pushed on along a lane and walked through a small village. At the other end 3 men suddenly loomed out of the darkness, and before they quite realized it, a shotgun was pointing at them. Valenta tried to bluff it out, but they started firing questions at Marshall then. Marshall knew little German and tried to bluff it out as a French worker, but one of the Germans spoke better French, and the game was up. The Germans were so obviously expecting to meet the escaped prisoners that they had no chance. The Germans marched them back to the village and phoned for police from Halbau. Marshall knew then there was no hope for bluffing any further, and managed to tread his passes, maps and compass into the snow. An hour later a police car arrived and drove them to a small jail. They pushed them into a tiny cell about 7 feet square, and there they found Humphreys, a slim Australian called Paul Royal, and Shorty Armstrong, whom they had seen last the previous night in 104. All 3 had been caught in much the same circumstances. Jammed in the cell like sardines, they found a little comfort in the common predicament. At least it was warm there in contrast to the weather outside. They chewed at their hard rations, talked for a while, and then slept, exhausted. At dawn the cell door swung open, and half a dozen tough-looking men in police uniforms called them out, pushed them roughly into a car, and drove them back to Sagan over the road they had walked. Not to the compound, but to the civil jail, where they were interrogated and pushed into a large cell full of three-tier bunks. During Marshall's interrogation, the phone rang in the little office, and he heard a guard who answered repeat in German into the mouthpiece, "Yes, yes, 6 at Hirschberg, yes, and 4 at Danzig." It wasn't hard to guess what it meant. They found the big cell bug-ridden and cold. It was a little surprising not to be taken back to the camp cooler, and a vague disquiet was growing in them. The door opened again after a while, and in came Ogilvy, Chas Hall, and 2 other escapees. Like Marshall and company, they had been picked up by patrols south of the Autobahn and found the Germans too suspicious to be bluffed. 3 times more during the day the door opened, and more escapees were shoved in. It was the same story. They had tried to walk across the fields, but the snow and slush had forced them back onto the roads and into the hands of the patrols. By dusk there were 19 of them. The guards gave them each 2 slices of black bread for the day, but no blankets. Wingsday and Tobolsky found the booking office hall on Sagan Station half full of escapees. A couple of hours earlier they'd all been chatting in 104, and now they were walking around not recognizing each other. Day brushed shoulders with Kirby Green and Kidder, who were travelling together, and the South Africans, Gowes and Stevens, and none of them even winked at each other. In the train to Berlin, Day sat apart from Tobolsky, but they joined up later and felt safer when they walked among the crowds in the Berlin streets. They had the address of a Dane living in Berlin, found him at his flat, and stayed there overnight. In the morning they didn't like the look of the Dane's German girlfriend, and spent the next 2 days in a bombed-out cellar. On the Monday they went to the Stettiner Bahnhof for a train to the Baltic port, and on the platform a man sidled up to Day, showed a police pass, and asked for his identity card. Day showed it to him, feeling the sweat starting up all over him, and the detective glanced casually, handed it back, and walked off. Unteroffizier. Tobolsky brazenly got his Soldbuch stamped for leave at the RTO's office. They reached Stettin safely, and after a day they made successful contact with some Frenchmen in a labour camp. The Frenchmen took them into their barracks and promised to find some Swedish sailors for them. They were waiting there in the morning when 4 German police burst in, and the leader demanded at once, "Where are the Englishmen?" Day and Tobolsky tried to bluff it for a while, but 5 minutes later they were being marched off with hands in the air and guns in their backs. The Dodger, travelling with Werner, accompanied the party of 10 workmen, including Pop Green, going by train to Hirschberg and then down to Czechoslovakia. Al wearing cloth caps and dirty clothes, they got out of the train at dawn at a little station just before Hirschberg, and there they split up. The Dodger and Werner set out to walk to Czechoslovakia, but it didn't take more than a couple of hours to see that the snow was going to beat them. They went to Hirschberg station that night, had a little trouble getting their tickets, but collected them eventually, and were sitting in the carriage waiting for the train to start when the police came through, looked very closely at their passes and said, "Komm mit." Taken to Gestapo headquarters, they found half a dozen old friends, Jimmy James, Pop Green, and some of the Poles. The Gestapo had the Poles standing with their faces to the wall, forbidden to move. After interrogation, they handcuffed the Dodger and pushed him into a cell. Plunkett, the mapmaker, and Dvorak lost their new freedom on the station at Klatou, Czechoslovakia, because they did not have the right type of leave pass. Danny Kroll and Sidney Dowes were nabbed in a barn near Oels. The Gestapo caught Van Viermisch in Berlin. Neely got to Stettin, where some French slave labourers hid him in a hut at the rear of a hospital while they tried to find him a ship to Sweden. They came back and told him that police were combing the whole town. Soon after that, police descended on the hospital, and Neely got out the back way as they were coming in the front door. He got to the station, caught a train to Munich, and miraculously avoided all identification checks on the way. But they picked him up in Munich station when he arrived. Tim's passes were good enough for ordinary times, but in that enormous Grossfahndung you needed more than good papers. The Germans rounded up several thousand people and threw them into jail. Some were innocent and later released. Many more were German deserters or wandering slave labourers. Some were criminals, fugitives from justice for a variety of reasons. The net that spread out from Sagan gathered them all in. One by one the Sagan escapees were rounded up, and a fortnight after the break, out of the 76 who had got clear of the tunnel, only 3 were still free. The Germans never did find them. 2 were already in England. The 3rd was on his way. At Berchtesgaden, on the Sunday morning, 26 hours after the break had been found, Hitler received the first full Gestapo report on it and flew into one of the rages that were becoming more frequent with him. Staying at Berchtesgaden at the time were Himmler, Göring and Keitel. The Führer called them into immediate conference and ordered that no minutes were to be taken of the meeting. There is not much doubt that by this time he knew what he was going to do. He had reached the state of mind that could deal with the escaping prisoner problem by one method only. Keitel later reported that Hitler was very excited as he told them what had happened. Himmler immediately blamed Keitel for it. It would take, he said bitterly, 70,000 police and God knows how many working hours to recapture the escapees. Göring blamed Keitel too, and Keitel in turn blamed Himmler and Göring, and a heated three-cornered argument developed in front of the angry Hitler. Keitel said they were Air Force camps, and therefore Göring's ultimate responsibility. He would not, he said, endure any more reproaches in the presence of the Führer. Hitler squashed the argument. They are all to be shot on recapture, he said flatly. As tactfully as he could, Göring protested not, be it said, on grounds of humanity, but of practical politics. To shoot them all, he explained, would make it quite obvious that it was murder. Besides, there might be reprisals taken on German prisoners in Allied hands. Hitler apparently saw the logic of this. In that case, he said, more than half of them are to be shot. Keitel and Himmler held a private conference afterward to plan the shootings, and later that day Keitel saw Generalmajor von Gravenitz, his staff officer in charge of prisoners of war, and told him that more than half of the recaptured prisoners were to be shot. Von Gravenitz, a regular Wehrmacht officer, was disturbed by the news. "We cannot just shoot these officers," he said, and the angry Keitel shouted at him, "The time has come for an example to be made, or we will not be able to cope with escapes. This ought to be such a shock that prisoners won't escape any more. Every prisoner must be told about it." That night, Himmler spoke to his second-in-command, Kaltenbrunner, in Berlin, and in the morning Kaltenbrunner issued the text of what has since become known as the Sagan Order. The increase of escapes by officer prisoners of war is a menace to internal security. I am indignant about the inefficient security measures. As a deterrent, the Führer had ordered that more than half the escaped officers are to be shot. Therefore I order that criminal Polizei are to hand over for interrogation to the Gestapo more than half of the recaptured officers. After interrogation, the officers are to be taken in direction of their original camp and shot en route. The shootings will be explained by the fact that the recaptured officers were shot while trying to escape, or because they offered resistance, so that nothing can be proved later. The Gestapo will report the shootings to the criminal Polizei, giving this reason. In the event of future escapes, my decision will be awaited as to whether the same procedure is to be adopted. Prominent personalities will be accepted. Their names will be reported to me and my decision awaited. SS General Müller, Berlin Gestapo chief, and General Neber, Criminal Polizei chief, sent for Wieland, and that night they showed the Sagan order to the Breslau police chief and sent him back with orders that Oberregierungsrat Scharpwinkel, Gestapo chief in Breslau, was to form an execution squad to dispose of the escapees caught in the area. Scharpwinkel appointed one of his trusted lieutenants, Obersekretär Lux, to head the squad, and he and Lux chose 6 men to help him. In Berlin, General Neber told Mertens, his secretary, to bring him the record cards of the recaptured prisoners. He sat at his desk looking at them and sorted them into 2 piles on his desk. Mertens remembers him looking at one card and saying, "Der muss dran glauben," he is for it, and putting the card on the bigger pile in front of him. Later, looking at another, he said, "He is so young." "No," and he put it on the other pile. Neber marked the cards on the larger pile with red crosses. Mertens said he was grimly excited and behaved uncontrollably. Top-secret teleprint messages went out to Gestapo bureaus, which had reported recapture of some of the escaped prisoners. The first message said firmly, "In 5 minutes a message will be coming over which is for the eyes of the senior official of the bureau only. No one else will be standing by the machine when it comes over." A few minutes later, the teleprinters tapped out the main message. It ordered the shooting of the officers being held, as laid down by the Sagan order, and commanded absolute secrecy. They arrested von Lindiner on the Sunday morning, on Goering's orders. He was confined to his room. Pieber reported later in the compound that he had gone to bed with a heart attack. That same morning, von Lindiner heard that some of the escaped prisoners had been lodged in Sagan civil jail. He rang Dr. Absalon and asked that they be returned to the camp. Absalon refused insultingly. He said he wouldn't take any orders from von Lindiner because von Lindiner had been relieved of his post. About midnight on the Monday night, the 19 men huddled on the bug-ridden bunks in the big community cell at Sagan jail heard tramping feet outside. The door swung open, and in walked a collection of sinister-looking men who bashed them to their feet with Tommy guns. The newcomers were all in civilian clothes, but it was a kind of uniform dress. They all wore heavy overcoats with belts and had black felt hats pulled down over their eyes. Marshall thought they looked like Hollywood's typical gangsters. They prodded the 19 outside and herded them into the back of a big covered-in truck, which shortly moved off. Marshall thought they were being taken back to the camp, which was only a mile or so away, but the truck kept going, and he soon realized that they were on their way somewhere else. He thought it might be another camp, and Valenta asked one of the guards who was sitting by the tailboard, nursing his Tommy gun and morosely surveying them. For answer he got a grunt and an ugly look. They could not see much outside the truck, and it was quite dark anyway, so they just sat there quietly and not very happily. It was nearly 3 a.m. when someone up by the tailboard said he thought he could see houses on each side, and soon he reported that they were running over a cobbled road and seemed to be in a largish town. The truck slowed and passed under what looked to be a stone arch, and a few yards further on it braked to a stop. The guards piled out shouting, "Raus! Raus!" and formed a cordon around them as they dropped one by one over the tailboard. In the darkness they could dimly see they were in a cobbled courtyard surrounded on all sides by stone walls about 3 stories high, pierced by little windows. There were bars over the windows. Evidently they were in a jail. Not so good. At gunpoint, the guards herded them through a door, along gloomy stone corridors, and up a couple of flights of stairs. At the top, they were pushed, 4 at a time, into tiny cells about 6 by 9 feet. 3/4 of the floor space in each cell was taken up by a wooden platform about 1 foot high. That was supposed to be the communal cell bed. Exhausted and hungry, the 4s in each cell crowed together on the platforms for warmth and slept fitfully. Crashing doors woke them at first light, and guards brought in their breakfast, a thin slice of black bread and a cup of ersatz mint tea, cold and horrible. No milk, no sugar. Funnily enough, everyone was in fairly high spirits. They hadn't the faintest idea what was going to happen, and for the time being anyway, they didn't let it bother them. They inspected the new quarters. Not much to see. 4 bare stone walls of dirty white, a concrete floor, thick steel door, and high up in the walls a small window, heavily barred. Looking at the window, they could see that the walls were nearly 2 feet thick. It wasn't very cold just then, and they relaxed on the wooden platforms and started yarning about their experiences since they crawled out of the tunnel. It was the first decent chance they'd had to talk, and in light-hearted accounts of their adventures their spirits rose further, and they passed an uneventful, though hungry, day. There wasn't room in the tiny cells for the usual bucket that served as a latrine in Nazi prisons, but if they banged long enough on the door, a guard came eventually and took them to a bucket down the corridor. The corridor reminded Paul Royal of a submarine. It was narrow, dank, and grey, with the forbidding steel doors inset at intervals. The only people they saw for a while were drab-uniformed warders carrying bunches of enormous keys for the old-fashioned locks. All of them were unfriendly. Later on, a doddering old German and a little Polish boy, a slave worker aged about 14, came around and perfunctorily cleaned the cells out. Marshall tried to get the boy to talk, but he didn't seem to understand, and the only thing he said, with a sidelong glance toward the door, was "Deutschland kaputt." Supper consisted of 2 slices of black bread and a bowl of watery soup. They felt just as hungry afterward. Valenta was getting worried, but trying not to show it. Only Marshall knew that Valenta had done intelligence work before he joined the RAF. Valenta knew the Nazis rather better than the others. None of them slept well that night. In the morning, guards several times entered the cells and took out 1 prisoner at a time. No one knew where or why, and nerves were getting a little edgy. In the afternoon, a guard came and took Paul Royal out, escorted him downstairs, out into the courtyard, under the archway, and into the street. It was the first time Royal had walked openly in daylight in a street for 4 years, and after the confinement of the cells, he felt exhilarated just to be looking at people and houses. It seemed a big town, and the guard, who was friendly enough, told him it was Görlitz, about 40 miles south of Sagan and not far from the Czech border. They walked half a mile, and the guard prodded him into a grey stone building about 4 stories high, and took him up several flights of stairs and into an office where a villainous-looking interpreter with a strong American accent told him to stand up and answer questions. Behind a desk sat an elderly grey-haired man who put the queries through the interpreter. The questions seemed harmless enough. Where were you heading? What were your plans? Where is all your equipment, compass and maps? What sabotage directions did you receive? What information were you to collect on the way? Royal answered simply and as disarmingly as he could. He denied with a faint smile that he had had any sabotage directions or intentions to collect information. He had just been 4 years behind the wire, he said, and he was sick of it. He suggested that the interrogator might feel the same if the positions were reversed. The interrogator seemed like some sort of civil police official. He did not seem particularly hostile, and after a while he said to the interpreter, "This man is obviously all right." Royal knew enough German to understand the words and began to feel a little better. The guard took him out after a while and back to the jail, but this time he was put in a different cell. As every man returned from his interrogation, he was put in a different cell, where he found other prisoners whom he had not seen since the night of the break. Evidently there were more of the escapees held there than the 19 from Sagan jail. The interrogations went on for 4 days. Marshall had a bad time. The men who questioned him were much more hostile than those who saw Royal. As soon as he was pushed into the interrogation room, a heavy-featured English-speaking German got up from a chair, walked heavily across the room, stopped 6 inches from him, stuck his face out till it was almost touching Marshall's face, and said ominously, "You'll never see your wife and children again." Not an encouraging start, but so obviously meant to intimidate that Marshall became very much on his guard and decided to play dumb. The interrogator behind the desk was a brisk, businesslike man who shot his questions out curtly. Marshall replied innocently to the same innocuous questions that Royal had been asked, and then the interrogator started insisting on knowing what Marshall had done with his papers. "Papers?" Marshall asked, stalling and playing dumb as hard as he could. "The papers you got in the camp," the interrogator said dryly. "You got papers, didn't you?" "Heavens, yes," Marshall said. "The Völkische Beobachter, that's Goering's paper, isn't it? The Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung and the—" "No," snapped the interpreter. "Forged papers and identity cards. Don't be stupid. What did you do with them?" Marshall looked surprised. "Did the others have them?" he asked. "Lord, I wish I'd had some. Where did they get them? How could they possibly have got hold of identity cards?" And he rattled on and on. He talked garrulously and aimlessly, misunderstanding some questions, deflecting others, and branching off onto new subjects, trying as hard as he could to give the impression of an amiable and voluble pinhead. It was the same when they asked him about maps. He'd had several good detailed maps. "Map?" he said. "Yes, I had a map. I made it myself from a war map of Europe in the Völkische Beobachter. It wasn't very good. I think that's why I was caught." And off he went again on a long monologue. The same with his clothes. He was wearing one of Tommy Guest's suits, and it was one of Guest's best efforts, dyed dark grey, and it had been topped off by a ski cap till they took his cap away. "Of course you realize," said the interpreter, "you can be shot as a spy for wearing civilian clothes around Germany." "Oh, this is only a uniform I changed about," Marshall said, beginning to feel uncomfortable. "See, I recut it, put boot polish on it and changed the buttons." "That's a civilian suit," the interpreter said. Marshall denied it again and tried to show where he had altered it. "Bring in someone who knows about cloth, and they'll tell you it isn't a proper suit." The interrogator pressed a button on his desk, and his stenographer walked through the door from an adjoining room. The brusque man behind the desk pointed to Marshall and spoke to her in German, telling her apparently to examine Marshall's clothes. She stood in front of Marshall, diffidently rubbing the cloth of his coat between bony fingers and looking at the seams inside. She was a gaunt, unhappy-looking woman, nudging the 40 mark, with untidy grey hair and long features like a tired horse. Covered by her head from the interrogator, Marshall smiled into her eyes, and faintly surprised, she smiled back. Turning to the man behind the desk, she said they were not proper civilian clothes, but demonstrating with her fingers had seams where one usually found them on uniforms. She left the room, and Marshall answered more questions, but his diarrhea of words exasperated the German so much that he slapped the desk with his hand and called the guard from outside, and Marshall was taken back to the jail. After 4 days, when everyone had been questioned, prisoners were all depressed. They had no idea what was going to happen to them and could get no clues at all from the hostile wardens. Hunger was worrying them all the time, as they only got 3 or 4 thin slices of black bread a day and a little thin soup. By the 4th day, there were hardly 3 words spoken an hour in any cell. There didn't seem to be anything more to say, and there was nothing to do except lie there and think about food and what might happen to them. A warden caught one of them standing on someone's shoulders and looking out of the window. He hauled him roughly down and told them that the next man who looked out of the window would be shot. On the 4th afternoon, after all the sorting out process of prisoners leaving one cell and being put back in another, Marshall found himself in the same cell as Royal, Ogilvy and MacDonald, a Scot with a patient and prematurely lined face. In the morning they heard tramping along the corridor, and there was the sound of abrupt voices. Down the corridor, cell doors were opening, and there were sounds of shuffling feet as prisoners walked out. Ogilvy banged on the door till the guards came to take him to the latrine bucket, and on the way down he saw 6 of the prisoners being escorted out by several heavily armed men. One of the prisoners was limping a little behind the others. It was Al Hake, and Ogilvy managed to whisper a few words to him. Hake said he had frostbitten feet. He thought they were going for another interrogation, and then the guards shouted angrily down the corridor and broke up the conversation. "By God, they're plug-uglies," Ogilvy told the others when he got back to the cell. "Look like the same bunch that brought us from Sagan, same coats and black hats over their eyes. Must be Gestapo." One of them risked a bullet by standing up and looking out of the window and saw the 6, surrounded by the guards, standing in the courtyard below. He watched as they climbed into the back of a covered truck, followed by the guards, and then the truck moved off and rolled out through the archway. The next morning the 4 in Marshall's cell heard more tramping feet and shouting in the corridor and more cell doors opening. They heard another party shuffling down the corridor, and looking out of the window again, saw 10 more of their prisoners below, herded into a covered truck with guards. They sat around all day tensely waiting their turn, but no one came for them. That evening, when the cell door opened and a warden brought in their cabbage water and bread, Marshall saw a big S had been chalked on the door. "Good show," he said. "S for Sagan. That must mean we're going back to the camp." "Maybe it means S for Schiessen. Shoot," said one of the others dryly, and there was a slightly hollow laugh. That evening 3 Luftwaffe guards arrived in the jail and slept the night in the room opposite them. They told the 4 prisoners they were taking them back to Sagan in the morning. It was true. About 9 a.m., the cell door opened and the Luftwaffe guards escorted them down to the station and took them by train back to Sagan, where they were pushed into the cooler for 3 weeks. This time it wasn't solitary confinement. The cooler was so full that everyone had company in his cell. After a couple of days they found out who else was in the cooler: Rees, Noble, Baines, Hudson, Revel Carter, Langlois, Trent, McBride, and several other naughty boys, but none of the 16 whom they had seen taken away in trucks from Görlitz jail. It was curiously quiet in North Compound for a week after the break. We woke up every morning waiting for reprisals, and none came. It was a faintly unnatural atmosphere as the days passed, and we wondered what was going to happen to us. And on the 7th day the Gestapo arrived to search the camp, about 6 of them, hard-faced citizens who walked into the compound and looked at us coldly. They hadn't come across Air Force prisoners before, which probably accounts for their innocence. Presumably they'd only dealt with their own population and the nameless victims they collected in their dungeons, people too terrified and in no position to differ with them. We were, I suppose, privileged, if you could call it privilege. So long as we didn't stick a nose over the warning wire or make public reference to Hitler's ancestry, the Luftwaffe doled out the black bread and potatoes and didn't go around the compound squirting Tommy guns just for the hell of it. We were still under the Luftwaffe and generally outside the orbit of the Gestapo, and Goering wanted it kept that way. The Gestapo curtly brushed aside any help from the ferrets and said they'd do the searches their own way. They let it be known, according to Eichaker, that they didn't regard the ferrets as being either intelligent or efficient. They dumped their coats and hats in the entrances of the huts and prowled around the rooms, emerging now and then with some of the nails we'd pulled out of the walls, or a lump of iron they didn't think we should have. These they piled beside their coats, and as they vanished again into the rooms, one of the boys reached around the hut door and took away anything we particularly wanted to keep. I don't think it ever occurred to the Gestapo that anyone would do that to them. It seemed to be so successful that he got a little more daring and swiped one of the Gestapo hats. A couple more people joined in the game, and the idea seemed to snowball. One of them, with more zeal than discretion, rummaged in the pocket of one of the Gestapo overcoats and rushed up to Canton a minute later, grinning all over his face. He pulled his hand out of his jacket, where he had been holding it like Napoleon, and there he was, holding a little automatic pistol. Unbidden, a little squawk of horror came out of the onlookers' throats. "For God's sake," said Conk, "put it back. Put it back. You're making it too hot. You'll start 'em shooting." Nervously the man replaced the pistol, and luckily for him he wasn't spotted. The Gestapo went off eventually, taking nothing we had particularly wanted to keep, but leaving behind in the ex-secret cupboards a hat, 2 scarves, some gloves, another torch, and some Gestapo papers. I imagine they were too embarrassed when they found out to do anything about it. Besides, it would have caused German casualties. All the ferrets would have died, laughing. They descended on the other compounds then, both British and American, and searched them, presumably more cautiously, but again finding nothing of importance. Lamentably, they were faced with failure of their mission, an unthinkable disgrace. So, in Gestapo fashion, they decided to search their own people in the Kommandantur. And behold, success at last. They unearthed a little black market organization involving, you'll never guess, von Lindeiner and von Masse. A Luftwaffe major who flew transport aircraft used to bring in choice wines and foods from Denmark, and they had a little store of the stuff under the Kommandantur cookhouse. We heard that a German who wasn't in on the game spilt on them to the Gestapo. Von Lindeiner was removed for court-martial. The Gestapo got 3 more victims in their stay. They could not understand how we had obtained 800 feet of electric cable for the lighting system in Harry. Being Gestapo, they could think of only one thing. Someone had betrayed the Reich. They looked through the inventories of the camp electricians and found that 800 feet of cable had been lost. Too late for the electricians to protest that the cable had been stolen from them while their backs were turned. The Gestapo, soaked in suspicion for years, took the 2 electricians and also the chief electrician, who had been too scared to report the loss of the wire, and they shot all 3. A new commandant arrived. His name, we heard, was Oberst Braun, but we didn't see him in North Compound. The expected reprisals came a couple of days later. He shut the camp theatre, put on 3 appels a day, and refused to let us have Red Cross boxes or food tins. There seemed to be something wrong somewhere. These were only pinpricks. After thinking about it for a while, we concluded that the new commandant wasn't going to extremes, probably, because his own personal reputation had not been affected by the break. Rubberneck was still around, having successfully talked himself out of trouble. According to a voluble ferret, Rubberneck had claimed that we must have finished the tunnel months before and bided our time to break it. We couldn't have dug it recently because we couldn't have dispersed the sand. They had found none under the huts, and we couldn't have put it on the snow. "It must have been dug at the same time as Tom," said Rubberneck. "And how?" inquired Doctor. "Absalon, could so many people get into Block 104 on the night of the break without being detected?" Rubberneck said we must have dug small tunnels from nearby blocks leading into 104. To prove it, he put on several surprise searches of the nearby huts, which proved, of course, nothing but gave time for official wrath to subside. After the unfortunate effects of blowing up Tom, they didn't quite know for a while how to destroy Harry, but settled it finally by pouring sewage from the honey wagons down the 104 end, sealing it with concrete, and then blowing up the other end. Rubberneck resumed his patrolling of the compound with a churlish glitter in his eye, though no one bothered very much about that except the other ferrets, who became more prudent in their lead swinging. We heard that Marshall, Ogilvy, Royal and MacDonald had arrived in the cooler. Jennings saw Pop Green and Pointer going into the cooler too. Then 8 more were reported in the cells, having returned, it was said, from a town south of Sagan called Görlitz. Next we heard Neely was locked up there. That made 15 returned out of the 76 who had got clear of the tunnel. It was puzzling. Hard to believe that only 10 had been caught, considering the tough conditions for the hard-asses. We assumed that some had been purged to other camps, perhaps to Colditz Strafelager. A fortnight after the break, it seemed that things were more or less normal again. The thaw had come and people were pounding the circuit without their greatcoats, revelling in the crisp air. With spring we were expecting the invasion almost any moment, and invasion meant the end of the war. We were just beginning to understand that release, someday, might actually become a reality instead of a dream. On a morning in early April, Peeber walked into the compound, went straight to Massey's room, and saluted politely. Would the group captain be good enough to wait on the new commandant in the commandantur at 11 a.m., bringing his official interpreter? "What does he want?" asked Massey. "Is he going to announce more reprisals against us?" Peeber's face was unusually solemn as he answered, "I cannot tell you, Group Captain Massey, but it is something very terrible." That rumour spread round the compound. No one worried very much. There had been 50 rumours since the break, some of them much worse than this one, and anyway Peeber was an old woman. Just before 11 o'clock, Massey was escorted out of the gate with his personal interpreter, squadron leader Wank Murray. They were kept waiting only a few moments in the commandantur, and then they were shown into the commandant's office, a normal barrack room, but with a carpet, a leather chair, a large desk, and on the wall behind it the standard decor of Luftwaffe officers' photographs of Hitler and Goering. Oberst Braun was standing behind his desk, a fairly tall man of about 50 with a lined, rather sad and patient face, fair, thinning hair, and the Iron Cross, first class, on his left breast pocket. Usually, when the commandant and the senior British officer met officially, there was a formal handshake and the usual military courtesies. This time, no handshake. Braun gave a stiff, slight bow and indicated to the 2 officers that they were to sit on 2 chairs that had been placed by the desk. Simulate and Peeber were standing beside the desk and looking at the carpet. The commandant stood up very straight and spoke in German. "I have been instructed by my higher authority to communicate to you this report." He paused, and Murray translated so far to Massey. Braun continued, "The senior British officer is to be informed that as a result of a tunnel from which 76 officers escaped from Stalag Luft 3, North Compound, 41 of these officers have been shot while resisting arrest or attempting further escape after arrest." Murray felt himself going red in the face. Unbelieving, he asked, "How many were shot?" 41, the commandant replied. Murray slowly translated the passage to Massey. Massey listened in silence and made almost no sign that he was hearing, except that he stiffened slightly in his chair, and the lines of his face tightened. At the finish, he said briefly, "How many were shot?" Wank answered, 41. He felt his face was bright crimson, and the scene in the room seemed unreal. There was a long, heavy silence. It dragged on and on as they waited for Massey to do something, and Massey just sat there looking unseeing in front of him. The tension was nearly unbearable when he raised his eyes slowly and turned them on Murray. "Ask him," he said, "how many were wounded?" Murray put the question to the commandant. The German looked uncertainly at a paper on his desk and then looked out of the window. He hesitated and then said, "My higher authority only permits me to read this report and not to answer any questions or give any further information." Massey said doggedly, "Ask him again how many were wounded." The commandant looked painfully uncomfortable. He looked out of the window and then down to his desk, trying to make up his mind, and after another hesitation he slowly said, "I think no one was wounded." "No one wounded?" said Massey, his voice rising a little. "Do you mean to tell me 41 can be shot in those circumstances and that all were killed and no one was wounded?" "I am to read you this report," the commandant said, "and that is all I can do." Simulate and Peeber had not taken their eyes off the carpet. Massey asked for the names of the dead. "I cannot give them to you," Braun said. "I have not got them. I have only this report which I am to read to you." "I would like to have the names as soon as it is possible to get them," said Massey. "Yes, I will do that," the commandant answered. And then, after another little hesitation, he added more quickly, holding a hand up, palm out in a slightly appealing way, "I must remind you that I am acting under orders and may only divulge what I am instructed to by my higher authority." "What is this higher authority?" Massey asked. Braun made a futile little gesture. "Just higher authority," he said. "I require to know what has happened to the bodies so that I can arrange for burial and the disposal of their effects," Massey said. "I demand that the protecting power also be informed." The commandant said that this would be done. He would let the senior British officer have every possible scrap of information as soon as he received it, but reminded him again he was always limited in action by higher authority. He rose to his feet. "I think that is all, gentlemen." Stiffly the two British officers withdrew, and as they emerged into the fresh air again, Massey said to Murray, "Don't mention this dreadful thing to anyone till I have released it in the compound." Murray still felt his face was crimson. Neither man felt like speaking, and Massey's face was grimly set. On the way back to the barbed wire, Peeber joined them. He seemed nervous and distressed, and said in a low voice, "Please do not think that the Luftwaffe had anything to do with this dreadful thing. We do not wish to be associated with it. It is terrible, terrible." Peeber at times may have been a hypocrite, but he wasn't this time. He was a shaken man. Half an hour later, back in the compound, Massey sent word around asking the senior officer in every room to report to the camp theatre for an announcement. With the order came a rumour that something dreadful had happened. We were a little uneasy, but it was only a rumour. We thought it meant reprisals were going to start in earnest. Possibly we were going to lose Red Cross food parcels for a while. God knows that would be serious enough. German rations were just enough to ensure starvation in its most prolonged and unpleasant form. About 300 officers crowded into the theatre for the announcement. Massey walked onto the stage, waited a few seconds while the rustling died down, and then spoke without preamble. "Gentlemen, I have just come from a meeting with the commandant in which he told me the unbelievable, the shocking news that 41 of the officers who escaped from the tunnel on the 24th of March have been shot." There was a stunned silence. A lot of people felt suddenly sick. Massey went on to describe the meeting briefly. He would announce the names of the victims as soon as they were available. Just now there was little more that he could say. There would be a memorial service on the coming Sunday. Still in a stunned silence, we filed out of the theatre, and within 2 minutes the news had spread to everyone in the compound. Horror lay over the camp. Mass murder was something new in the quiet backwater of prison camp, however unpleasant the life was. A lot of us wouldn't believe it. "I know the Huns are murderous idiots," said a man in my room, "but they've never been game so far to murder British or American people openly in mass, and I can't see their point in starting that sort of thing on relatively harmless prisoners." It about summed up the feeling. I suppose if the truth be known, we wouldn't believe it because we didn't want to believe it. The mind builds its own defences. Most of us thought that the whole thing was a bluff, that the 41 had been moved to another camp, and that we, believing they were dead, would be intimidated into stopping all escape activity. But there was no getting away from the fact that it had been officially announced. We held a memorial service, and every man in the compound sewed a little black diamond on his sleeve. The commandant was afraid there might be some sort of demonstration or revolt, and ordered all the guards to be more watchful than usual, more ruthless if they had to be. When some of us were a little slow getting into our hut at lock-up time, a sentry in a goon box sent a spray of bullets over our heads, and a couple more zipping around our feet, kicking up little spurts of dust. The air raid siren went one afternoon, a lovely sound. We got more kick out of watching American fortresses draw their vapor trails across the sky than we ever got out of a barrel of raisin wine. The Germans knew it and ordered that whenever the sirens went, we must run into our huts and pull the blackout shutters across so we couldn't see anything. Some of us were a little slow getting inside when the siren went that afternoon, and one of the guards running in emptied his pistol magazine at us. He was a rotten shot, but several people sitting in their rooms in 109 jumped smartly out of the way when a couple of bullets ploughed through their wooden wall. They drew rings around the bullet holes with a pencil and labelled them Easter Eggs, Sagan, 1944. A couple of minutes after that, a guard got an American sergeant standing innocently in the doorway of his hut in the next compound. The bullet went in his mouth and he died instantly. It was not exactly unprecedented for a guard to kill one of the boys, but it was an unfortunate time for another killing. Some of that nice insulation we had wrapped around our minds began to wear thin. The people who believed the 41 were still alive grew fewer and fewer. At dusk one day, Eichaker pinned a piece of paper on the notice board. Someone passing looked at it casually and gave a shout, "Here are the names!" And in seconds there was a crowd around the board. For the benefit of those at the back, a man yelled for silence and slowly read them out. There were little gasps and curses behind as people heard their friends named. Someone said, "That isn't 41, it's 47. A dozen people checked his count. He was right. 47. It was a terrible list. Roger Bushell was on it. That wasn't unexpected. The ever-courteous Tim Wallin was on it. So were Gordon Brettell, Henry Picard, Birkeland, Casey, Willie Williams, Al Hake, Chaz Hall, Tom Kirby Green, Johnny Stour, Valenta and Humphreys, who had been caught with Royal. Dennis Street was on it too. He was the son of the British Permanent Under-Secretary for Air. The Germans certainly hadn't been discriminating. Faced with the names we got back, that stunned horror. Some of them were only kids, a year or two out of school. People stood about talking it over almost in whispers. Some still wouldn't believe it wasn't a bluff. Germany had been the first nation, in 1929, to sign the Geneva Convention, which lays it down that escape attempts from prison camps are quite legitimate and are not to be punished harshly. A couple of days later, another list was pinned to the board. It was a short one, just including the names of 3 more who had been shot: Tobolsky, Cookie Long, and Danny Kroll. It brought the names up to the round figure of 50. It was noted that with the exception of 2 Czechs, every non-Briton who had escaped had been reported shot. A few days later, a group of prisoners who had been badly wounded when they were shot down were taken out of the compound for repatriation to England. Massey was among them. About 2 hours before they left the compound, the Germans called for all the kit of the 50 and took it all away. It must have been rather senseless bluff. They knew the repatriates would tell everything they knew of the shootings when they got home, and presumably the Germans thought that the demand for the kit of the 50 would indicate that they had not, after all, been shot but removed to another camp. None of it seemed to make sense. We'd been worrying ourselves sick over it for weeks when the few escapees who had returned came out of the cooler and back into the compound. We pumped them for news, and they, dazed by our news, wouldn't believe the others were dead. Some of them had seen them taken from the cells at Görlitz, presumably for another interrogation. They were perfectly all right then. It must be a bluff. There didn't seem to be any common factor in the shooting. Why shoot some and send others back? Al-Harka had had badly frostbitten feet and was in no condition to try to escape again. Yet he'd been shot, and no one was wounded, so they certainly hadn't been shot trying to escape again. We began to think once more it must be a bluff, and then the Germans brought back the kit of the 50 that they had taken on the morning the repatriates left. A couple of days after that, they brought in some of the personal belongings of the missing 50 photographs and things like that. Some of them were blood-stained. A fortnight later it was all put beyond doubt. The Commandant informed the new SBO, Group Captain Wilson, that there had been delivered to him the urns carrying the ashes of the 50. No need to ask why they had been cremated. It destroys the evidence of the manner of death. Engraved on each urn was the locality where death had occurred. 4 were engraved Danzig, and just 4 of the escapees had been making for Danzig. 4 were marked Hirschberg, 2 more with the name of a town near the French border. There were several from Liegnitz and a lot from Breslau. Still, we couldn't find any common factor in the shootings. The only clue was the round number of 50. It was pretty clear they'd just taken 50 and shot them as an example. God knows that was logical enough under Hitler. There was only one bright point in the whole affair. Bit by bit, we pieced together information brought in by the Tame Guards, and eventually established the fact that the rather staggering figure of 5 million Germans had spent some of their time looking for the prisoners, and many thousands of them were on the job full-time for weeks. That meant that the break was some sort of success, if one could overlook the heavy cost. The commandant got us some stone and let a working party go to a nearby cemetery to build a vault for the urns. There was already a row of graves in that cemetery where other victims from the camp had been buried. 50 were dead. 15 were back with us. We wondered what had become of the other 11.